Check, check.
Good morning, everyone. Hi. We're using microphones because we're here in person, but also some people are joining us by live stream. And I want to just start off by thanking June for organizing the program this morning. It's great to have another installation of our Tuesday Midday Meetup series. And of course, I want to welcome my colleague and friend, Rabbi Mark Katz.
Thank you for having me.
You all know that Rabbi Mark Katz is the senior rabbi at Temple Ner Tamid, and together we're part of the Montclair Board of Rabbis, which is the group of 5 rabbis who work together among the 4 congregations, and we've had a lot of opportunities to meet one-on-one for coffee or breakfast, but also to work together in the community. And as I was looking over your bio, I told you I found some surprising things that we have in common.
What they are.
So you were an undergraduate at Tufts University.
Yeah.
I worked at Tufts Hillel for 3 years between college and rabbinical school.
What years?
Before you graduated, it was 1996 to 1999. And you were captain of the swim team in your undergraduate
I know you're a
at
swimmer.
Tufts. I was also on the swim team in high school. These are just things I didn't happen to know about you before. And we're here this morning to talk about your second book. It's very impressive to me as a rabbi that you've found the time and pursued the passion of writing alongside a very busy life as a congregational rabbi. For those who haven't read it, Rabbi Katz's first book is called The Heart of Loneliness, How Jewish Wisdom Can Help You Cope and Find Comfort, published by Jewish Lights. And your second book, Yochanan's Gamble, is published by the Jewish Publication Society. And we're just talking now, maybe you can show people the cover of your book, about this beautiful painting that's made it to the cover of your book that really shows Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai debating what to do in the middle of a crisis with Jerusalem burning around him. You called your book Yochanan's Gamble. Why did you choose that book, and why did you make his story the feature?
So, for those who know who Yochanan ben Zakkai is, he is the father of Rabbinic Judaism. So I'm going to tell you just the story of basically how Judaism changed in the year 70 CE. So before the year 70, primarily Jews sacrificed to God in the temple in Jerusalem. And that's ultimately how they did their religion. But then Rome comes in and they destroy the temple. And the moment of Rome's destruction of the temple has a myth to move from the period of the Second Temple to what is known as the rabbinic period, the period of the rabbis. These are the guys who wrote the Mishnah and the Talmud and basically who remade Judaism after the temple was destroyed. So imagine you've got a group of zealots who want to fight a war against Rome. And Jerusalem is fine. It's up on a mountain. It's got walls. It's impenetrable. And so what do? They burn the stores of food so that people have to open up the gates in order to get more food. And in that time, Rome's going to stream in and they can fight that war against Rome. And in the midst of this tumult, as people are starving, a leader whose name is Yochanan ben Zakkai sneaks out of Jerusalem and ends up having an audience with Vespasian, who is the governor at the time. And while he's talking to Vespasian during this kind of founding myth, he says to Vespasian basically, "Hail, Emperor." And Vespasian looks at him and says, "What are you talking about? There's an emperor in Rome. I'm not him. I'm the governor of Judea." And he says basically, "Just wait." And no sooner does he say that than someone basically marches into the room and says, "Good news, the emperor is dead. You're the new emperor. Hail the new emperor." And so Vespasian gets ready to go to Rome, and on his way out the door, he says to Yochanan, "Look, you probably did this with your prophecy. So ask me for anything, and you got it." And what does Yochanan ask him for? He asks him for a little plot of land in a place called Yavne, just south of where they are, where he can restart Judaism in that moment after the temple is destroyed. And he asks for 2 rabbis to be saved, okay? Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Zadok. And there's a kind of postscript to the story where basically a rabbi named Rabbi Akiva basically says, what a jerk. You've got this guy looking at the emperor of Rome, who's predisposed to give him what he wants, and he didn't ask for, what should he have asked for? For Jerusalem to be saved. And then there's a note afterwards. There's always an anonymous voice in the Talmud that basically says he asked for the thing he knew he could get, not the thing he really wanted but was likely not to get, when he would have then squandered that one request. And that way of thinking, that pragmatic way of thinking, understanding that sometimes you need to make compromises, sometimes you have to take the win instead of the thing that you really want, sometimes you got to read the room, is actually part and parcel of a big turn that Judaism makes. Before that, the kind of primary images of Jews were things like the prophets who stood on soapboxes and screamed at people and just said God's words, and sometimes, mostly actually, were pretty ineffective. Or the priests who were perfect in their way of worshiping God, but did everything by the book and didn't step outside of the formula for how to do these sacrifices. And then you get the rabbis. Yochanan ben Zakkai births them, and they are pragmatic, they are thoughtful, they are compromises. They get their hands dirty. They do all of that. And it's them who save Judaism. Much of what we know about Judaism today, and we take for granted, was invented by Yochanan and his students. Take Passover, for example. Before him, everybody went to Jerusalem and sacrificed an animal. With the rabbis, suddenly, you had the Passover Seder. They looked around and they actually modeled it after a Roman symposium. Right? What is a Roman symposium? You sit around, you talk about ideas, you drink wine, and you eat good food. Well, that's what Passover is, right? And so from Passover to Sukkot to the prayer service, we pray 3 times a day because of them. Like, they reinvent Judaism, but they weave into Judaism this very pragmatic strain, which is a helpful thing for us in our time period when we're not very good at these messy compromises, these incrementalisms, these kind of messy, dwelling in the messy middle. And so that's what Yochanan's gamble is, and I framed the book around him, and the book is really about his legacy in Jewish law.
So what I found fascinating about reading the book is that you take some of the most famous ideas in the Talmud or stories in the Talmud, and you tell them all through the lens of pragmatism. And I'll just say, when I was at the Jewish Theological Seminary, I don't really remember any moment when I was studying the Talmud where pragmatism was lifted up as a primary theme or frame for the Talmud. And so I'm curious how you came to see this frame. You know, you say in the prologue of your book, you're originally trying to pitch a book about integrity, right? And so how did you come to see the frame of this book? How did you personally relate to pragmatism? When did you first start to see the theme of pragmatism in the Talmud? And why did you think pragmatism was such an important message for now?
Thank you. So, I actually, this book was born out of Objects R. I had written my first book on loneliness, and basically it flopped. It didn't sell. The only good thing to come out of the book, in terms of like, for my own sense of ego, was it was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. But basically, the publisher got sold to a different publisher the month the book came out. It didn't make it into bookstores. It was print on demand. It was only available on Amazon, or if I sold it, and got no marketing. I mean, like, it failed. So I went looking for a new publisher. And the way that I thought I would get my foot in the door was I went on to JPS, Jewish Publication Society, who's the publisher of note in the Jewish world. They're like the classic one. You probably have, Tanakh that's published by them or something like that. And I met with their editor-in-chief, and I had seen on their website that they were commissioning a book on Judaism and integrity. And I was like, great, pick some issue and explore it. Like, I think I know how to do that. And so he said, great. I won't take anything from anyone else until I get your proposal, and I started working on it. And it turns out the more that I worked on it, the more I realized I couldn't write the book because I couldn't define integrity. And that's a really hard thing to write a book on integrity if you don't know what the word means. For me, the problem was that if integrity is basically just sticking to your guns, staying true to your values, I couldn't explain how a Nazi didn't have integrity. But yet I'm not willing to say a Nazi has integrity. And if I say that integrity is really just being ethical, then why don't I just use the word ethical or moral? Why do I need to figure it out? But the more that I did research into this, the more I realized that actually Judaism, it's hard to say Judaism really has true integrity to it, right? Eventually I've come to a definition where I can say Judaism does, but I actually found Judaism incredibly, or really Jewish law, very slippery, right? People change the laws all the time. Leaders will not do what they want to do because the people aren't quite ready for it. People will make these really messy compromises. Even though they want A, they'll choose much lesser than A. Almost like the way, or very much like the way that Yochanan ben Zakkai did in front of Vespasian. And like the word I kept using was slippery. Judaism felt slippery. And so I thought a little bit about that.
I'm glad you didn't make that the subtitle of your book. Judaism is slippery.
Yes.
We don't need that out in the world.
Yes. But the more that I thought about it, the more that I realized actually it was not a bug. It was a feature of Jewish law, right? It's not something that makes Jewish law worse. Actually, it makes Jewish law better. You can call it slippery, but you could also call it malleable. You can call it flexible. You can call it like compassionately open. And all of those are true. And so as I started thinking about this, it kind of coalesced around this one word, pragmatic. And then I was having a conversation with my father-in-law, who thankfully said, oh, that reminds me of Yochanan ben Zakkai, and thus the book was made.
So I'm curious in terms of your own leadership, what role pragmatism plays, and if you consider yourself to be foundationally a pragmatic person.
Yeah, by the way, it's so important for me, and I think about this all the time. I start chapter 3 of the book, which is about leaders not leading too far in front of people. There's lots of examples of that. By talking about COVID, right? If you think about it, and I think probably this community was the same as our community. Our community was not really ready to go back into the world as soon as the CDC said you can go back into the world. We had some people who were, but for the most part, when we opened the congregation, we were allowed to be inside with masks. We thought that if we just did it, people still wouldn't show up. We ended up doing outdoor services for a while, even though we were allowed to be indoors. And when masks became optional, we delayed that a little bit. And by the way, I was ready to allow people indoors and to allow people to take masks off. I believed the CDC. But as a leader, I couldn't be too far in front of people. I could push them to say, come back in person when some of them were scared to, or to say, come inside when some of them were scared to. But what I couldn't do is say, this is where I'm at, you must meet me there. And so we took tiptoes into reemerging, in part, not because I felt it was a safety issue, but rather because I listened to the people around me. And when I deal with social justice in our congregation, it's the same thing. I will not support a bill, right? Because congregations will often get behind bills and push them from the social justice realm that doesn't have legs, right? I want to see it already in committee, already out of committee. I want to see a big, broad coalition of people working, and I want to help them by having our community put our finger on the scale, not chasing a pipe dream. And so as a leader, all the time, I'm looking for the pragmatic thing, which often, by the way, angers people sometimes, because it means that they feel like I'm going too slow, or I'm dragging my feet, or I'm not willing to take big risks, or I'm not willing to speak out in big ways. But at the end of the day, you have to meet people where they're at. And if you don't do that, you will fail.
So one of the things I enjoyed most about reading this book as somebody who is familiar with many of the Talmudic stories or the Talmudic reasoning principles that you used is seeing them through a new light. So, for example, the two that really struck me were the story of the oven of Achnai, which I would have said before reading your book has a different punchline. And also the principle in Jewish law that if you do something, there's a difference between what you do initially, like what the ideal case is, lehatchila, and what happens like b'diavad if something goes a little wrong, what decision made. Can you talk about those two examples through the lens of pragmatism?
Yeah. So the very beginning of chapter 1, and by the way, I will say, if you end up reading the book, you just have to trust me on this one. Chapter 1 is the most philosophical of the chapters. It is the hardest of the chapters, okay? Everything else is easier after chapter 1. So just get through chapter 1, but chapter 1 provides the philosophical framework for the rest of the book. So it had to come at the beginning, and it's really important. So the oven of Achnai is one of my favorite stories in Judaism. It deals with a group of rabbis who are fighting another rabbi about basically whether or not an oven is pure or not, okay? And the rabbi who is the minority voice, the single rabbi, says, look, if I'm right about this oven, see this tree over there? Let it uproot itself, move, and replant. So the tree does that. And the rabbis say, you can't tell the kosherness of an oven from a tree. So they say, okay, see this stream? Let it reverse course and start going the other way. So the stream stops and starts flowing the other way. And the rabbis say, you can't tell the kosherness of an oven from a stream. So then he says, fine, see the walls of this house? Let it fall in on us if I'm right. They start falling in until a rabbi starts yelling at the walls and saying, butt out, this isn't your fight. So then he says, well, if I'm right, let God show up and say I'm right. And God comes and says, what are you doing? Rabbi Eliezer is right. And one rabbi, whose name is Rabbi Joshua, stands up and says, God, first of all, this isn't your fight, right? You gave us the Torah. In fact, it says in the Torah itself that the Torah, quote, is not in heaven. It's here with you. And if it's ours to do with, it's ours to judge. And in fact, you also gave us a rule which said that we must follow the majority. And because we must follow the majority, and society works well if we actually follow these kinds of frameworks and these kinds of rules, we can't have you butting in all the time, right? We can't listen to you on this one. You're outnumbered. It's us versus him, and if we count you, then it's us versus him and you, and we still win. And basically, by the way, there's a postscript to the story where a prophet named where a rabbi named Rabbi Nathan runs into the prophet Elijah and says to Elijah, so tell me, what was God thinking at the time when he got kicked out of the study hall? And Elijah said, God laughed, saying, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. Now that's the story. But what's really important about this story for what we're about to talk about is the question about what is truth. And by the way, this is also the most controversial chapter in the story too. So most of us define truth as if the truth. So pick any thorny issue you want, right? Pick whether or not abortion at 20 weeks is moral or not, right? Let's just pick that. Wouldn't it be amazing if we had an audience with God and God could say, well, it is or it isn't. And then you would know what the truth is, right? And most of us define truth as that, the thing that is. And there's a kind of fancy word for it, which is called the correspondence theory of truth. It's the primary theory of truth throughout time. It corresponds to the facts of reality. It corresponds to what? If I want to know if the sun is going to rise, I look outside, I see the sun is rising, I know it is true that the sun is going to rise. That's the correspondence theory of truth. There's a second theory of truth, which I won't get into, called the coherence theory of truth. It's a minor theory. It's not that important for us right now. But the third theory of truth, which appears, by the way, in the early 20th century in America, it's the only American-born philosophical movement, which is called American pragmatism. Okay? And it's people like John Dewey, you might have heard these names before, William James. For them, truth is not what is, right? That would be that first, if you could talk to God. Truth is what works, what has utility. And by the way, this becomes really important in an era where like science is exploding, right? Because if you think about it, like the classic example, even though it postdates them by a couple decades, is like quantum physics, right? If you know anything about physics, you know there is Newtonian math and physics, which deals with the big stuff. You have math equations that can very accurately predict how planets move, how gravity works, the big stuff, right? And then you've got great math equations that work for the little stuff, how electrons jump around, how atoms bind together, all of that. If you use the big math for the little stuff, it doesn't work. And if you use the little math for the big stuff, it doesn't work. And so Einstein, by the way, died pulling out his hair, trying to figure out how to have what's called a unified field theory for these two different kinds of sciences, right? The first theory of truth would say there is a truth, we just haven't figured it out yet. The pragmatists don't really care. What they basically say is like, well, which math should we use? The math that works, right? The math that doesn't break down. And so if you got some medium-sized thing, right? If it works, use the big math, use the big math. If it works, use the small math, use the small math. Now that's just a little piece of this, right? But at the end of the day, what is this Oven of Achnai story telling us? It actually is telling us the pragmatic truth is sometimes the better truth. Because they had an audience with God. They ignored the audience with God because it, quote, wouldn't work to have God butting in. Instead, they picked the thing that would work, which is a society that has rules and boundaries around how you ultimately choose how the law gets made. And in their case, it was, if you've got 3 judges saying one thing and 2 judges saying another, the 3 judges win. You respect the courts, you respect the legal process. And that is pragmatic truth, more than its correspondence theory. Then I'll give you one more example if I have time, which is in chapter 2, I talk about Judaism's, or Jewish law's interesting tension around settling in court cases, right? So why would settlements be bad? And by the way, I taught these texts to a group of lawyers who all laughed because they were like, our job is to settle. What are you talking about, right? But why is settling bad? Because what is the point of a judge? And by the way, in the ancient world, a judge was a jury, right? A judge's goal is to listen to all the available evidence and get the closest to truth. Person A is suing person B, and the judge's job is to say they're stand-in for God. Is person A right or person B right? Everybody's understanding that, right? Well, what does settlement do? Settlement takes into account all these other ideas that are not looking at truth. It might be you need to save everybody money, so you're going to cut the court case short. It might be that you don't want infighting in your community, and so you're going to do the thing that's going to lead to the most peace. Those are all quote-unquote pragmatic concerns. They're doing what's going to work best. And so the rabbis really wrestle with that, and they ultimately come out on the side of settlement. And they say you can settle a court case because pragmatic concerns override the search for truth until the judges have deliberated. And at that point, they have then defined truth for themselves, and it is now too late to settle. Which, by the way, is different. I know we've got probably lawyers in this room. Different than American law, where you can settle after the judge has already come out with their decision. But that gives you a good example of this kind of pragmatic truth versus truth, correspondence truth. And that allows, by understanding that something is true if it works, that allows the rabbis to make all kinds of different changes and take laws and mold them and decide in the moment that they're just not going to work. Because at the end of the day, truth has 50 different concerns to it, not just, if I had an audience with God, what would God tell me is the truth?
I was reading your book last week, and it influenced a decision made Friday night at services. We don't always have a minyan on Friday nights at Shomrei, because Saturday morning is more of our big times to come to services, and someone was there to say Kaddish. And there are some vague teachings about, if you have 9 people, can a child hold a chumash and count as the 10th, or can you open the ark and the Taurus count as the 10th, And I would say in general, I've always viewed those positions as like suspicious, or I don't know. I don't even know what word to put out to it. Just like, no, like a minyan is 10 people. If there aren't 10 people there, Torah is not a person. A child with chumash on their lap is not a person. But what happened was on Friday night was there were 10 people at services. And one of the 10 people was an adult who was in the process of converting to Judaism. And there was another person at services who was saying Kaddish, and had come specifically for the purpose of saying Kaddish. And I decided for the first time at Shomrei, to open the ark and to count the Torah as the 10th person. And I don't think I would have done it if there wasn't this everyone else is looking around, they're like 1, 2, 3, you know what I mean? They see 10 people, but they might not know that one of the people is not yet Jewish. And the person was just not Jewish at all. If there had only been 9 people in the room, I might not have done it. But because of the influence of reading your book, which is all about pragmatism, I made the decision to do it. And I think what's interesting about the interplay between integrity and pragmatism, or pragmatic truth versus correspondence truth, is that if pragmatism is a value, a good value, not like something we attack political candidates for changing their mind and being pragmatic, but something that we see as like a way of working on both aisles and getting something done, something as a positive value, something that I would say your book says saved Judaism and continues to save Judaism, then one can act with integrity by being pragmatic, because it's one of the values that you're privileging.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I end, I think it's chapter 3, with this anecdote, which is it's not Talmudic. It's like an anecdote from medieval Europe. But the idea that a woman shows up at their rabbi, and she has a chicken, and she asks the chicken, "Is the chicken kosher?" And the rabbi looks at her, and he looks at the chicken, and the chicken is clearly not kosher. But the rabbi will say to her, the chicken is kosher. He will lie to her, because he understands that this might be the difference between her having dinner and not having dinner, right? And that at the end of the day, there is something incredibly compassionate about bending the rules, and part and parcel of Jewish tradition. I'll give you one other example. I have a chapter in there about avoiding infighting, right? And that we will bend laws to avoid infighting. And there's a precept in Judaism called MIdday Meetup, that we do things for the sake of peace. And so, there's an example where in Judaism, in order to actually attain ownership over something, in order for something to be yours, that is nobody's, right? We're talking a piece of fruit you find or something like that. You have to actively grab that fruit and pick it up, right? If the first person to pick up the fruit owns the fruit. But there's a case where imagine there's a guy who's on the top of a tree, and he's beating the top of the tree, and the fruit are falling down to a tarp below him, right? And somebody comes and they grab a piece of fruit from that tarp. Who owns the fruit? Based on what I just said. What? The guy who finds the fruit on the ground. The banger did all of the work, but technically Jewish law doesn't permit him to own that fruit until he actually picks the fruit up. So imagine you got a guy banging the fruit on the top of a tree and another guy collecting the fruit. And Jewish law says the guy collecting the fruit actually owns the fruit. If I was the guy on the top of the tree, I would come down and probably slug the guy on the ground, right? And so what happens? The rabbis see this as a problem and change the law. And they say, although technically, in every other circumstance, you don't own something until you pick it up, in this particular case, for the sake of compassion, for the sake of peace, for the sake of a community that quote-unquote works, right? The definition of pragmatism is doing what works. We are going to change the law in this case, and it is akin to stealing to take the fruit when you see someone is beating the tree above. And so those are baked into the system of how Jewish law works. And so as a rabbi, I'm constantly asking that question. It sounds like you did the other day too.
Well, what I'm curious about, your book mostly focuses on how the rabbinic approach to Judaism and the Talmud have a through line of pragmatism, which actually for me was like a radical rereading of many familiar stories. That's mostly the focus as opposed to the implications for today.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, just sitting next to you as a conservative rabbi, you're a Reform rabbi, we see Jewish law differently. I'm curious to hear how you think pragmatism might come up differently for either Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism, or for Reform rabbis and Conservative rabbis.
Yeah. So it was funny. My father-in-law, who's modern Orthodox, because I dedicated the book, he got a copy of the book before anyone else did. And he read the book, and he says to me, wow, I didn't realize that you Reform Jews model all of your Judaism off of, like, the Talmud, basically. Like, their way of thinking is your way of thinking. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, I think you're right, but I actually think conservative Judaism is even
Well, what do you think
more.
he meant by that?
I think he means this sense of, like, you know, sometimes change matters, and you have to change for the greater good, and you can't be stuck in your ways, and that tradition is malleable, and all of the things that we've talked about so far. I mean, what I will say is this. In my mind, there are two cauldrons of Jewish history. Now, what do I mean by that? Think about glass, right? Glass only can be shaped and molded, and it can become very malleable when it gets heated very hot. And so what are the two periods in Jewish history where the glass gets heated really hot? Number one is after the destruction of the temple, and number two is Jews entering into modernity, right? After the French Revolution, Jews end up having an audience with Napoleon, who asked them like 8 or so questions, and they basically get 7 of them right and punt on the last one. The last one was, would you marry a Christian French girl? They're like, let's not talk about that yet. But they get all the other ones right. And they become citizens. And Jews enter into society and suddenly have a place with their Christian neighbors. They have a way to vote. They are full parts of society around them. Now, just as the rabbis, after the destruction of the temple, had a tremendous amount of flexibility, but also the mandate to make Judaism survive in their new milieu, eventually that cools down, right? You've got the rabbis, and after the rabbis is a period called the Genoic period, and then after that is a period called the Rishonic period. All 3 periods are periods of tremendous amounts of creativity, right? Then you've got a period called the Acharonim, which happens after the Black Death, where basically Judaism becomes not malleable anymore, but very concrete. There's not a lot of changes that happen, right? But then modernity happens. Jews enter into society. And you have 4 primary approaches to modernity. Number 1, some people say, wow, I can be like my Christian neighbors. Let's be Christian. And they leave, okay? Number 2, actually, I would say 3. I'm going to combine 2 of them. Number 2 is people say, okay, let's try to be Jewish and modern at the same time. And you find different expressions of that. Reform is one expression, conservative is one expression, modern Orthodox is one expression, right? But those are ultimately trying to make Judaism and modernity work together. And the ratio, let's say, of Judaism and modernity might be a little bit different depending on who you are and where your movement is, right? And the final is a full rejection of modernity. Let's imagine ultra-Orthodoxy, right? Saying, like, this stuff is too scary. We are not going to change at all. And what I would say is that middle ground, like, let's figure out how to make Judaism and modernity work, is the same kind of spirit that the rabbis had, which is let's figure out how to make Judaism work in this post-temple Roman-occupied world. And so I actually see the rabbis being that kind of response to the cauldron in the same way that I see Reform and Conservative Jews being that response to the cauldron. Now, we're going to have different things that we're concentrating on because we're living in a different milieu, and our modernity looks different than their modern world. But at the end of the day, it's A, the mandate to make Judaism work in a world that's constantly changing, and B, a fidelity to a tradition that must survive, that makes Reform and Conservative Judaism so akin, I believe, to the way the rabbis are back then.
So I'm going to find a time to talk to you about this privately in detail. I'm just worried if I keep going down this particular line as much as I want to, it might not interest everybody here as much as it does me. So I'll just make this comment, which is when Jewish law is something you learn about, but then you make choice through that knowledge, which I think classically is the philosophy of Reform Judaism, I would think that pragmatic considerations, whatever they might be, increasing numbers of interfaith families or fitting in with your surrounding society, would more easily have more weight than in conservative Judaism, where officially you are conserving the tradition unless there's a moral reason to make change. And so when I look at an issue like officiating in interfaith weddings, or can rabbis be married to non-Jews, which are two differences right now between Reform and conservative Judaism, I'm kind of curious how much of that is a difference in either the privileging of pragmatism or the freedom to be pragmatic because you're not concerned about the binding nature of Jewish law, and how much of it is a different set of values where it's consistent, for example, with your values to have, right, if you believe in matrilineal patrilineal descent, then it's entirely consistent with your values to have a rabbi married to a non-Jew, because it doesn't matter which parent is Jewish. So I'm kind of curious, like if you use an example like interfaith marriage as a difference between Reform and conservative Judaism, how much of the difference do you think is about pragmatism, and how much of it do you think is about values?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I would actually say that, like, look, when most Reform rabbis started doing interfaith marriage, they probably started doing it for pragmatic reasons, right? They didn't want to lose congregants. There was a lot of pressure on them. They understood that, that numbers were shrinking. Like, that comes into play. Over the course of time, as you get to meet more interfaith families, and our congregation is probably a third interfaith families, maybe even more, then you start realizing, oh, actually, like, you can have really wonderful families that are part of your community that are interfaith, and so it becomes more ideological. But often changes happen because of pragmatic reasons. And I would push back to say that doesn't, like, that does happen in the conservative movement too. I mean, I'm not necessarily...
Driving on Shabbat
that
is a
exactly what I was
exactly.
gonna say. That was exactly
that
what I was gonna say.
particular position was made for pragmatic reasons.
Totally. But look, the tools of change are different in the times of the rabbis, but it still was change, right? So let me give you a good example. So in chapter 7, I talk about the different tools for change, and one of my favorite kind of things that the rabbis do is about the line in Deuteronomy that says that if you have an insolent and rebellious son, you take him into the town square and you stone him to death. Now the rabbis had a problem with that. They didn't like that. And so what do they do to change
There were
it?
too many sons, right?
Yes.
They were concerned about the future.
Yeah. So what do they do to change that? They couldn't do what I do, right? So for example, I'm a Reform rabbi. I actually believe that the Torah is a product of human hands. And there might have been God in the room, but like at the end of the day, there's politics, and I've studied too much biblical criticism to not know that there's a lot of human in the Torah.
I also believe, for the record, there's a lot of human in the Torah.
Oh, good,
Okay, yeah.
good, yeah. So, good. I was like a little nervous in a conservative synagogue saying that.
It's not 1950.
Yeah. So what do I do when it says if one man lies with another man as he lies with a woman, it's an abomination? I just say, like, that might have been true for its time. It's not true for my time. I'll do gay marriage because, like, it's not binding on me right? But at the end of the day, like, there are Orthodox rabbis who also believe what I believe, and they jump through similar hoops to what the rabbis jump through. So let's return to that son, that insolent and rebellious son. What do the rabbis do? They say, well, if he's a son, but he's held accountable for his actions, he must be a minor because he's called a son, but you can't be held accountable for your actions until you're basically bar mitzvah. So he must be between 12 and a half and 13 years old. And if we're going to call him a glutton, let's define the amount of food that makes a glutton as so much that basically no one can eat it. And if we're going to call him a drunkard, let's assume that he needs to drink so much that basically drunkard means no one could keep up with it. And so at the end, they've defined who the son is so narrowly that they basically say, never has there been and never will there be an insolent and rebellious son. They unwrite the law. They change the law, but they do it with the assumption that the Torah is from God, and therefore they have no right to excise the section or to say it doesn't apply. But what they can do is put strictures to make as radical of a change as any change that the Reform movement might make, right? In Orthodoxy, by the way, there are Orthodox gay rabbis who will do the same thing with if one man lies with another man as he lies with a woman, it's an abomination. First, they'll define lies as only sex, therefore love and marriage can be okay. Then for sex, they will define the word shachav, which is the word to lie down, and they will look at different ways that it's used throughout the Torah, and they will say more often than not, it's violent. And so therefore, because shachav is used in a number of places in a violent context, we're not talking about consensual sex, we're talking about violent sex, and they will essentially allow themselves to still be gay and still have that line exist by defining the line in a certain way. And that, by the way, is the way the rabbis do it. Now, does that mean that their way of thinking is any less authentic than mine? No. If I felt that way, I probably wouldn't be a Reform rabbi. But what I would say is that the idea that radical changes and departures can happen and that one can have freedom to do that existed 2,000 years ago in Judaism and is part and parcel, I believe, actually, of both our movements.
Yeah, I would actually say that the difference maybe is not in terms of how pragmatic one movement or one rabbi is, how much they value pragmatism, but what tools do they have at their disposal to address pragmatic concerns.
Correct.
I think a Reform rabbi has far more freedom to address pragmatic concerns simply by making a change, and a conservative rabbi or conservative movement would still use more of the tools that you see in the Talmud, would be somewhat constricted by those tools in terms of the ability to make change.
Yeah, totally. I mean, but let's take another thing that's besides driving, right, which is the use of microphones on Shabbat. Now, on the one hand, that, and I would say more conservative synagogues than less probably use microphones at this point, right?
For sure.
Yeah. On the one hand, you can say it's ideological. And by the way, pragmatic and ideological sometimes work together really well, right? It is really important for me that people can hear. It is a value, and if I don't do that, they will not fulfill their obligation to have heard the Shaliach Tzibor pray the prayer, and their amen won't mean anything, right? That's ideological. But there's a little pragmatism mixed in there, and also feeling like I want elderly people to be able to come, and they're going to stay home if they can't hear me, and my synagogue can't get that big because people in the back won't be able to hear. Those I truly believe those concerns are in the room when a conservative synagogue is deciding whether to use a microphone or not.
So I am conscious of time. I hope that what this conversation has highlighted is that you have taken classic and central aspects of Rabbinic Judaism, which we are all the inheritors of, and filtered it all through the lens of pragmatism, forcing us to think about the ways in which pragmatism has kept Judaism alive and the ways in which we might be free to use pragmatism to keep meeting the needs of our days. I highly recommend that everybody purchase the book, read the book. I know that you have some copies with you.
I do, yes. So I can set them up to sell them for you. We have about, I'm here for probably about 15 more minutes, and then unfortunately I have to go teach it at my synagogue. But I sell the book for anybody who wants to buy it, and I would love, if you end up reading it, I mean, I'm right around the corner, shoot me an email, or next door, literally, and shoot me an email, and I'm always happy to talk about this kind of stuff. So, I mean, can I give a final closing thought?
Definitely.
So, I once had a professor, his name was, interestingly, Lenny Kravitz, no relation to the singer. And he once taught that, he asked this question, why is it that Moses is called Moshe Moshe Rabbeinu, not Moshe HaNevi? Why is it that Moses is called Moses our rabbi or our teacher and not Moses our prophet? Didn't Moses speak to God and speak God's words as you would expect a prophet? Why does he get the moniker Moses the rabbi? And the answer that he gave is that the whole point of a prophet is to accurately say God's words to the people, and it almost doesn't matter if the people heed those words. All that matters is that you say those words. And as I said before, when you open up the Bible, the prophets were mostly ineffectual, actually. Okay? But what is the job of a rabbi? And kind of taking, playing on this phrase in the book of Numbers where it said it's a weird kind of grammatical thing, and Moses moved the people instead of the people moved with Moses when they were wandering in the desert. That the point of a rabbi is to speak God's words in such a way that it moves people, that people listen to them, that they will act, they will do, and that ultimately we live in a time of too many prophets and too few rabbis. And no matter where you are, whether in politics or at your work or in friend groups, the goal, I hope, after reading this, is to be inspired to be more like a rabbi than anything else. Because the world needs pragmatic thinkers and leaders who are willing to dwell in the messy middle, get things done, and compromise. Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
So I think I'll set up over here, I think. Yeah. So if anybody wants the book, I'll set up over here.
So lunch is out, and Rabbi Katz is here selling and signing books. Yeah. One of the main questions that was sent from Cuba is whether or not the status of being entitled to Shomrei was only when you were living in your father's household, or after you left your father's household, and because you were entitled to that status even after you left your father's household, let's say before returning, they considered it to be a status of lineage and not a status of circumstantial. I forget their exact wording, but that's what the tshuva is based on. That's what the tshuva details. That's what it. So I'm happy to send it to you. Yeah, but please email me so I don't forget.
I just want to let you know before you get it.
Yeah. No, I have it.